for me, the question is often, well, if I could say that, this melody, the symphony is beautiful, and a music theory could say, theorists could say, well, it's beautiful because there's these relationships between notes and there's harmonies and there's a certain, and so on. I think in the case of games, we need to talk about rules and goals. And what I found actually most useful is the ontology less as here's this whole thing, read all of it and you will have acquired knowledge, but rather as a way of thinking about things. This goes to this notion that there's two goal hierarchies, one that the game supports and knows under the hood, and the other is what the player thinks the game supports. And I think that's a really interesting area in sort of game design, is these sort of players discovering goals that are supported by the game.
José Zagal is a professor at the University of Utah teaching game design and ethics in video games. In 2005, he brought forward the Game Ontology Project, which sought to break games down to their core elements, categorize them, and study them further. There comes a time in any field where you learn more by breaking things down piece by piece, be it physics, chemistry, various forms of mathematics, even philosophy and linguistics. Today, José joins us to talk about the Game Ontology Project as well as more recent research it has led to around goals in games, and ludonarrative dissonance, which occurs when there's a conflict between gameplay and narrative. Enjoy. The earliest sort of entry I could find for Game Ontology Project is 2005, which is like... I guess game studies was pretty young back then.
Yeah.
What was your thinking at the time, and how has that evolved over the years?
At the time, I was a PhD student at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology. I was working in computer science with Dr. Amy Brookman. On a different part of campus, Janet Murray has started up what she called a Game Morphology Project. And so that project turned into what became the Game Ontology Project. And the basic idea was to make sense of games and decompose them into constituent parts, as it were, and make sense of the relationships between them, but do them in a way that was sort of similar to what was called the psych ontology, which is sort of an ontology of concepts. So you think of like a bicycle is made up of handlebars and wheels and so on. And wheels as a concept can be then a part of other elements, like a car can have a wheel, for example, even if the wheels on the bicycle are very different from the wheels on the car. And this separate ontology was used in computer science, so I believe that's where it came out of. We didn't spend too much time looking at that, but there was that idea. And then we also were inspired by Jussi Holopainen and Staffan Björk wrote a book on design patterns. These two different ideas were sort of percolating and led to our talking about games and trying to kick the tires on these different concepts. So the idea is you sort of come up with a concept and think, well, is there a game that kind of breaks that or that makes this concept less useful for analysis? And so then maybe we need to break it down. And Michael and I collaborated on more work in that area. And in papers that I sort of see as sort of children of or part of the Game Ontology Project. So we wrote a paper on sort of making sense of time and how time is kind of interesting and weird in games, and how do you sort of conceptualize that. I've described the approach as mostly, let's look at a bunch of games, as many as we can think of, as broadly as we can think of, and try to see if there's commonality to certain concepts that kind of make sense to, as explanatory or descriptive. So here's these games, we see this thing being used across multiple, maybe that's a thing. Maybe that thing could then be decomposed into subtypes and so on and so forth.
Right.
A lot of people have asked me over the years about the Ontology Project as a way to do, let's say, formal reasoning, which the Game Ontology Project is not a good match for that kind of work. And what I found actually most useful is the ontology less as here's this whole thing, read all of it and you will have acquired knowledge, but rather as a way of thinking about things. So it's guided my thinking when I'm when I try to make sense of, let's say, fighting games. Well, how do they work? What makes a fighting game, and what are the more important concepts that might be higher up that might be then broken down to other ones, and how do these all relate to each other? So that's what I found to be more sort of useful over the years.
And I guess one of the main things, and this is in the FAQ for the Game Ontology Project, but one of the main things in terms of thinking in kind of a different way is that there's a clear separation between rules and goals.
Yeah, which is probably semi-controversial these days.
Oh, really?
I mean that in the context. So a couple of years ago, or maybe this was last year, so not a couple, Jaakko Senos and Marcos Montelo published this book called The Rule Book, which is sort of an overview of the different types of rules that exist in games. I'm working with two colleagues on a book proposal intended to be the equivalent book, but for goals.
The goal book.
So the goal book. What are the different types of goals in games? And this actually comes from work that we did as a sort of stepchild of the Game Ontology Project with Rogelio Cardona Rivera and Michael Debus. And obviously, I reached out to Jaco and Marcus and said, hey, we're planning on doing this thing. What do you think? And obviously, the first question is, well, aren't goals also rules? And the answer is, well, does it really matter? Is sort of usually my answer. And I say that in the context that I think definitions are useful, but definitions aren't necessarily equal to truth. And so I see definitions as tools. And by that, I mean, if there's stuff I want to talk about and I want to make sure I don't talk about things that are out of that, then a definition can be a helpful way to sort of draw a line on the sand and say, I'm just going to refer to everything within this box, not this other box over there. So if I wanted to talk about games but not include sports, I might define a game to be a certain thing, purposely excluding, sports, for example. And that's an analytic reasoning. So it's not saying that this thing X is not part of sports, but rather saying for the purpose of this discussion or this analysis or these insights, let's not talk about these other things. So in the context of goals and rules, I think, well, if goals are a type of rule, well, I would say to them, well, you didn't talk about them in your book, right? And it turns out that goals are actually, there is a wide variety of different types of goals. And so if it's a special type of rule, there's still a book worth of things to talk about in the context. And if they're not, there's still a book worth of things to talk about.
I can see why there's a separation. I mean, in video games, like in real life, you have rules, and sometimes those rules can be broken. But in a video game, code is law. So, if the designer says and the programmer says you can't do a thing, then you really can't do a thing aside from some edge cases where, a bug or an exploit finds its way in the game. And then a goal is different to that because, you can tell the player what a goal is, but also they're going to come up with their own goals. I guess as illustrated by games like DayZ and any sandbox game where it's like they just put you in the world and they don't even really give you a goal. They just say like, have fun. And you go like, okay, well, my goal that I invent is I'm going to build a castle, which is very different to a rule.
Yeah, and that's obviously a player goal, right? So it's the player brought their goal to the game. And we tried to distinguish between sort of design goals or what the designer intended for the game in the same way that players can bring their own rules to the game as well, right? I can say, well, I'm going to play this game with my own self-imposed rule of I will only use one hand or I will never use a healing item, those sorts of constraints. But I think even in the case of player goals, in order for a player to have a goal that they want to see realized in the game needs to somehow acknowledge actions that relate or tie to that goal. Right. So if my player goal is I want to build a replica of, I don't know, Disney's castle inside of Minecraft, the game needs to support the kinds of actions that will help me make progress towards that goal. So I need to be able to, put blocks on top of other blocks and I need to be able to look at them from a certain distance so I can see if it looks like Disney's castle. There need to be different kinds of materials, maybe different colors, and so on and so forth. And so invariably, even if a player has a goal, that goal will have to be sort of decomposed into sub-goals that the game recognizes and accepts. And if it doesn't, then basically they're just orthogonal, right? I might have the goal of making friends in a multiplayer game that allows no between-player communication of any kind, and say, well, that's probably going to be impossible because the game actually has no way to support you, communicating with someone else or getting their player number or their player ID or sending them a message or anything. And so it's like, I could have that goal, it's just not possible, it's not supported by, let's say, the game verbs, as it were.
I found it interesting when you say, like, the sort of goal of the Ontology Project, which, by the way, I feel like it kind of sucks that the acronym is GOP, because I was sending you the email and I wanted to use GOP and I was like, it kind of sounds like I want to talk about the Republican Party, but
well, maybe that's on you. I think in my mind, when I see GOP, the first thing that comes to my mind is Game Ontology Project. So
good, yeah. Maybe I'm too much of a politics Yeah, yeah. Maybe I need to touch grass. It's interesting that when you talk about how the original intent was like not formal and logical, because my mind kind of instantly went to there. I guess in every field, every sort of science reaches a point where people want to break it down to its core elements. Physics goes all the way down to quantum mechanics and
Mhm.
geometry and shapes and chemistry and biology. I have a book right here which is about symmetries and breaking symmetries down to their core elements, and then I guess there's prime numbers, and then so some are more abstract and some are less abstract, and then you get like Nietzsche with the genealogy of morals, and Borges with the philosophical concepts, and I guess whether it is sort of logical or whether it is like a terminology, like what do you believe that it's brought to game design? Like, what does the practice give us?
I guess earlier when I said formal reasoning, that has like a very specific meaning. So there is formality and formalisms in the Game Ontology Project. So it's
Okay,
not just, hand wavy, we made up a bunch of stuff out of thin
sure,
air.
yeah,
It's not formal reasoning in the sense that you can't apply mathematical logical reasoning to it, right? So you can't say, A, therefore B, and not C, that kind of thing. Um, and that was a purposeful decision because invariably, um, we, we, we had to recognize a couple of things. First of all, this is built off of and comes from games as they existed, at that time, right? So the initial pass was games as they existed 20 years ago. And if anyone's been paying any kind of attention to games, you'll know that there's new games coming out all the time.
yeah,
And game designers are often innovating and creating new kinds of games, new kinds of entertainment, new mechanics, new rules, new gameplay, etc. And so any sort of ontology that, uh, if you're trying to be comprehensive, then the ontology itself would have to be updated regularly to account for like new games and kind of shifting understandings. So that was sort of a first starting point. A second one is that ultimately the ontology is about concepts of the mind that are culturally and socially defined. There isn't going to be strict definitions that apply forever and ever, and things are going to be really sort of gray and kind of squishy around the edges. One of our sort of things that we leaned on here is prototype theory. So Aristotle, for example, when he's interested in sort of categorizing the natural world, has this sort of idea that there's a perfect exemplar or something, and that's how you define a bird is like, well, a bird has these characteristics, and you're either a bird or you're not a bird. And if you talk to ornithologists, they will say, well, animals are kind of weird, and nature's kind of weird, and biology is kind of weird, and there are plenty of things that are sort of kind of not quite, etc. Um, and if you think of sort of weird, um, if you think of animals that maybe meet 5 out of these 6 and for being a bird, but not a couple of others. And what is this animal? Right, the platypus. Like,
mm,
okay, it's a mammal, but it kind of it's unusual because it's not quite air quotes
yeah.
standard in that sense.
Like, why
And
is a tomato a fruit, sort of thing?
yeah, and so for lots of things, especially when you get into aspects of human culture, um, the way we actually create knowledge and generate knowledge is closer to, we have ideas of categories, but these categories are are always going to be squishy. And so,
Mm,
depending on when you are in the world, if I ask you to draw a bird, the bird you will draw, like it calls it like your default bird or your vanilla bird,
mm,
um, will look different, right? And very few people will draw like by default an ostrich, for example, right? And that what that means is basically we have a notion of the ideal member of this category, but other members may be closer or further. And for some things, we might have multiple ideals. So maybe the ideal of a parent can the notion of a parent doesn't have to be, let's say, just a mom, but it could be a mom or it could be a dad or it could be a grandparent, and it's squishier, it's more flexible. And sometimes these categories can overlap, sometimes they don't, and so a member might be closer to or further away from being, let's say, central to a category. And in the case
mm,
of games, you might say, well, let's say we have a notion of a power up in a game, and we have a definition for a power up. And then we might run into a game where there's an element that kind of meets this definition of power up, but kind of doesn't in some ways. And so within the context of the game ontology, we have this idea of like a strong example as being, oh, this is closer to being like a canonical member of this category, and a weaker example, so something that's kind of borderline on the edges. And we posit this idea that over time, if you start to run into lots of weak examples of something, maybe what we're seeing here is a new sub-element of the ontology that's sort of being discovered or being worked on or developed or iterated that would then, all those weak examples would be strong examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's, now we don't have, we subdivide power-ups into power-ups A and something else that's not quite the same as the other one, for example. And that's just like the way knowledge is developed and created, and these concepts are sort of defined within player communities, within designer communities, and so on. And we see that happen like all the time. I've asked people like, well, what's a boss? And they might say, well, a boss is does the boss have to be bigger than the player characters if there are player characters? Can you have a boss fight in a game that doesn't have like enemies? And they start thinking, well, what is a boss fight? And so conceptually, maybe it's one thing, but maybe representationally something else. And some people say, well, if there's an actual character on the screen, there's not a boss fight. Okay, but is it okay if the character is like a giant robot that has lots of, it doesn't have to be like organic in its representation. And so people can argue and disagree about that. And eventually we might get to a point where we think, okay, maybe the boss fight is less what we're looking for. Maybe the concept we're looking for is the boss challenge, which is this idea like, oh, there's a moment where the difficulty goes up significantly compared to previous moments in the game. And the player maybe has to use skills or abilities that were introduced in moments prior to that. So to defeat this boss challenge, you have to master like a double jump ability that maybe you just picked up or something. So it doesn't matter if it looks like a giant gorilla that's fighting you, or if it's an area with lots of fireballs shooting across the screen and so on. It's just like an increase in challenge.
Which elements like that were the most challenging for you to categorize? You mentioned time, and I can imagine time would be really hard, but are there any others that were challenging?
So back in the day, we sort of ignored goals entirely. We said, goals matter. We're not going to go do this right now, and we focus on other parts of ontology. So I'm going to say it was 20 years later we came back to that, and I say we, in this case it was myself and some new colleagues who started thinking about that. I think the thing that was challenging overall for the project was, how do we deal with representational elements?
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time discussing this because in some cases we felt that things, like, it made a difference to the player experience. Some cases it made a difference to how people conceptualized things. But other cases realized like it doesn't really matter, right? And ultimately we decided to sort of exclude all of that and basically realize like, if we're going to do an ontology that includes representational elements, then it's like an ontology of culture, right? Where we distinguish between weapons and items and armor and hats and et cetera, et cetera. And we realized, okay, that's probably out of scope for the time and effort we want to spend, and probably not that interesting either, right? From a game design perspective, if a game has hats or has like helms, what do we really care about? Like, it's a bonus of defense.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like it does affect the player experience, but also like on the formal side, on the completely formal side, it's what matters is like how much armor that piece gives you, not even what it looks like, right?
Yeah, so there's a middle area where things get tricky. Mostly because we can think, one way to think of the game is, here's a game, it's its own little thing. Let's say it's its own little package. There's a player who's outside of the game, and how does the player know what's going on in the game? How does the game, and so there's an intermediate layer, which you could think of like, that's the interface. Is the interface part of the game? Yes. Is it really part of the game sometimes? Well, maybe no. But also yes. And so that was also a complicated place to think about. Especially in the context of mini games, where a lot of games were sort of, this game is mostly menu driven, right? You're just selecting options from menus. And if in a game if the menu is, a list of items versus, elements on a wheel or different button presses, is this a fundamentally different game? And for the player experience, yes. But from a sort of formal sense, I would say the answer is maybe.
Yeah. It's funny because, the interface can affect player behavior in ways that, like, I previously didn't think possible. And the first episode of this podcast was with Malcolm Ryan here in Australia, and I know that you at one point came down to Macquarie University and gave a talk about the ethics of war games. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is because he recently released a study about morality bars in games and found that just the presence of a morality bar can affect player behavior. And then he started playing with it, and he's like, what if it's on the left as opposed to the right? What if the player trusts the morality bar as opposed to if it had shown itself to be untrustworthy? And he found that, trust in the morality bar was very important, but the fact that it was there as opposed to not being there, even just that can affect a player's choices in games.
Yeah, and so then the question is, well, maybe under the hood, the game has, we're keeping track of a number, and the number goes up means this, number goes down means something else. Will affect how the rules of the game are applied. But then, if it's a bar in the corner, if it's a wheel, or if it's a dial, or if it's the character's clothing, these are representationally all very different, right? And they are fundamentally different to the experience of the player, as you were saying. For the context of the ontology, you say, well, is a life bar a concept that we should have the ontology?
Yeah, and I was browsing through the ontology and I saw it there. Well, actually, no, was it proposed, or is it one of the proposed ones, or I can't remember.
I don't remember. Yeah. It's been a while.
Yeah, it kind of rams it home, like how infinite the possibilities are. Like when you actually start like looking at all the variations of it, and even when you consider just how many variables go into a single mechanic, like a tower trying to shoot at a creep in a tower defense game could have 5 to 20 variables deciding the behavior of that mechanic. And then when you consider all the new games coming out, and games by their nature are trying to, especially in the indie space, are trying to do something different and something interesting. So we're just constantly adding to it. And, like Raf Koster made the point on this podcast that it's a bottomless pit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's creativity, essentially. It's what could you do in a game? Anything. It's we are only limited by our imaginations.
Yeah.
And maybe right now, technical reasons, but there's a good track record of those going away over time.
Yeah. It's quite different to like, prime numbers. At one point, prime numbers was just purely abstract and, didn't have any practical use until cryptography came along, and now all our online transactions are based on it. And, similar could be said for like, Riemann and non-Euclidean geometry, and which was later, at first it was, people thought it was useless until Einstein picked it up. Do you envision any sort of similar situation with breaking down game design elements? Like, do you think that, because to me, it seems like it's much more complex, like even more complex than some of these other things that we're talking about, because you've got all of the dimensions of other art forms combined, plus interactivity. And then even just the time element that you mentioned, that in itself adds enormous complexity. So I imagine, if something like that happens, it'll be, a fair ways down the track. But do you envision the field getting to a stage of study where someone like an Einstein could come along and say, like, this is perfect for what I've been studying?
I'm not sure about Einstein. That's an interesting thing. What would Einstein think of games and game design? So games are currently studied from lots of different perspectives. So some people are studying games as cultural artifacts the same way you could study a painting, for example. You could study film and so on, right? So sort of speaking to, what is this saying? What does this say about culture? What does this mean? But at the same time, there are other people who study paintings and games, let's say, from a technical angle. Other people focus on the broader culture around games. So player communities, what are players doing? What was it? I like to focus on the games and kind of strip away a lot of the sort of representational elements and focus on games as, sort of the rules and goals and how these combine to create certain kinds of experiences. For me, the question is often, well, if I could say that, this melody, the symphony is beautiful, and a music theory could say, theorists could say, well, it's beautiful because there's these relationships between notes and there's harmonies and there's and so on. I think in the case of games, we need to talk about rules and goals and what actions there are, what possibilities there are for the player to do. What does the possibility space look like? And I think we can get to a point of saying, well, I think this game is beautiful to me because, and where the reasons are coming from the gameness. I'm not saying games can't be beautiful for other reasons. I'm just saying that's what I'm interested in. That's where I focus. And a lot of people say, like, oh, I love this game because the story was so, rewarding or interesting. And I'm like, perfect. I can look at a painting and just enjoy the colors in it and not know anything about, who made it, why they made it, what it's trying to communicate. I can just enjoy the colors, for example. Once you strip away those things, that's kind of focusing on what I think is kind of the little nugget that's interesting or that's special, perhaps. And then that sort of expands outwards into other areas as well. So when you think of games as, well, there's rules, there's goals, there's objectives, there's actions you can do. Well, there's plenty of systems outside of games that are not games for which this kind of thinking could be valuable. I'm the CEO of a company and I really want to encourage my employees. A naive approach would be what I would call like, oh, let's gamify this. Let's make it more game-like. I think that's a naive approach because that's sort of like putting chocolate on the broccoli and then expecting people to eat it.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And I think perhaps a better way to think about it is similar to what economists do, right? So economists focus a lot on sort of incentives and what incentives people have. As a game designer, you can focus on, well, what rules can we have? What goals can we give people that people will align hopefully with the incentives they might already have as human beings, right? And so I think a sort of game design approach, I'm not saying you turn the workplace into a game, but rather if you understand people's incentives, you can design rules that will hopefully align with those well, rather than turn into rules that people will try to break or try to get around and so on. It also helps in contexts that are not games that may be interactive, right? If you're designing, museum spaces, if you're designing, experiences at, let's say, like theme parks, if you're interested in social spaces where you want people to interact in a certain kind of way and think about how do you design these spaces, a lot of that, we can learn a lot from game design and bring that out into that context. And again, it's not about, oh, let's add points, let's add, badges and that kind of nonsense. It's about the fundamental understanding of, and the process too. I think game design, game development, the iterative nature of it and playtesting as a method, I think is something that other areas can learn from as well.
That's such a great point. And with some of those other fields that we were talking about as well, like, the symmetries and stuff like that, a lot of the sort of usefulness that came out of them was in their comparisons to other fields. Like, symmetries had surprising uses in particle physics and stuff like that. Have you seen like unexpected uses of the Game Ontology project from either the, development side or academic side, or like, non-gaming fields?
So what I've heard, and this is all sort of anecdotal, right? From from professional game developers, they'll often say, "Look, I like this idea of this ontology because it helped us kind of break down what we were trying to do, and kind of reinforced the importance within our company to come up with a shared language for the things we were trying to implement." And that could be tricky, right? If you imagine, we have a game company, we've hired, people for a couple of years, and someone rolls in and we might be using the same words, but might not be saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Or even though sometimes people told me like, oh, it's like a nice framework that we could then took our game and kind of plaster stuff on it and then develop their own ideas. Like maybe for a specific company, they want to distinguish between a power-up and an item, for example. And so they could explain, okay, when we're talking about power-ups and we have our power-up design team over here, which is different from our item design team, which is over there. For a lot of people, a power-up is an item. And they're like, no. In our game, like we're drawing a line between them.
It reminds me of when you skip a blind in Balatro. I don't know if you've played it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, when you skip a blind and you get what's called a tag, but I didn't know what a tag was. And so there was a thing that it said, the next tag you get double the tag. And I was like, what is a tag? And I started doing all this stuff to, see if it would be doubled. Like I would sell a Joker and I would do this. Is that a tag? If I buy a Joker, is that a tag? And I guess this is behind some of your recent work as well, right? Because you've been doing more work in recent years around goals. I was reading through some of the papers and you were talking about how a lot of academics and game designers, when they talk about goals, they're not actually talking about the same thing. And so this kind of led to the GFI framework, which is goals, feedback, and interpretation, which you want to be complementary to the MDA framework, which is mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And so, for a long time, the MDA framework, I've found it to be like a useful lens to think about games, especially in terms of how developers kind of come at it from mechanics first, whereas players kind of come at it from aesthetics first. And then I'm vaguely aware, within my sort of like criticism bubble, my games media bubble, I'm vaguely aware that there was this thing called the ludology versus narratology debate. And I didn't really know too much about it. It always seemed a bit to me like, ¿por qué no los dos? And then the GFI framework came along. So what sort of gaps were you trying to fill with the GFI framework?
GFI is complementary to MDA, as you were saying. And I think MDA is great. And what we realized what was missing, and again, think of this, we were thinking in terms of, we were coming at it from goals. And so you're playing a game on screen, the player sees a message from the game that says, go defeat Dark Lord, blah, blah, blah. Now the player has to figure out, like, what does that actually mean? The player might assume, oh, this is a typical adventure game, this combat, RPG, I'm going to level up my abilities until at some point I'm going to fight this Dark Lord, blah, blah, blah. When it's actually more like Lord of the Rings, where, to defeat the Dark Lord, blah, blah, you just have to do something completely orthogonal to that. Take this item and drop it into a volcano. And so there's sort of this disconnect or a possible disconnect between what the player thinks they're trying to do and how to go about it, and what the game under the hood requires you to actually do, and the things that is sort of keeping track of. But that's where the sort of GFI comes in.
Right.
And in some games, there's a disconnect, right? Some games, the game told you one thing, you interpret it as in a certain way, and then you never get the feedback, so it doesn't make sense. It might happen sometimes that you do a thing, and then the game says, good job. And you're like, what? I don't know what I just did, but there was some goal that the game had in mind that you just achieved.
Yeah.
Achievements are a nice example of that, and typically they're meta goals.
Yeah.
But you're playing the game and suddenly this thing pops. It's like, oh, good job. You killed 50 people with a knife. And like, oh, I didn't know that was the thing.
Yeah.
Adult players do play with a list of achievements on the side, and they're trying to do them, and they basically roll those goals into the gameplay itself. I think the concept they were trying to connect a lot was this notion of ludonarrative dissonance, which is where the things you do in the game are sort of in conflict with the story of the game, right, or the narrative of the game. I'm playing a happy-go-lucky, thrill-seeking adventurer called Nathan Drake, who likes to, find lost treasures and recover them somehow. It's like that's who this character is. He's happy-go-lucky. He's always, in a good mood, or not always good, but he's kind of funny. He's got friends and so on. But then in the gameplay, I'm in the situations where I'm like killing all these people, right? I just killed 20 soldiers that came, and then the next room, I'm like, here's another 10 soldiers that I killed, and their bodies just lying everywhere. And you think like, well, somehow that there's a disconnect there. And as a player, you understand, that's a specific type of challenge that this game wants to give you. And the only context I can think of that may make sense with the story is, there's other people trying to prevent you from accomplishing that goal of getting that treasure. But you kind of step back and go, does that make me kind of like a psychopathic murderer who doesn't care about all the people that got killed? And so sometimes the disconnect is the player's story, the interpretation of the story is, I'm a good guy who's trying to rescue this treasure, and these other guys were bad guys and so on. But then the game has me eliminate everybody from the screen.
Right. That's probably one of the most fundamental and replicable examples of ludonarrative dissonance, right? Is I think I'm a good guy, but actually I'm a bad guy.
Well, so the disconnect is between the gameplay and the story. So there's a lot of games where the game is going to be unreliable and lead you to believe that you're a good guy, and then kind of flip the tables on you, like, aha, actually you're the baddie, and then you go, oh no, and that could be a really interesting emotional experience for the player. We can think of Shadow of the Colossus as an example of that. BioShock, Spec Ops: The Line does that as well. It's perhaps less flipping the table, more like slow descent into madness.
Right.
Here, the disconnect is sort of between the actions and the story. The game is saying, you're a hero, the world is an emergency, the world's about to suffer, we're going to be destroyed, you're the only person who can do this. And then you're spending half your time, moving chickens back and forth because the farmer's like, please, can you get my chickens? They ran away, right?
The trope of like, get to the escape pod, and then you spend 5 minutes looking for power-ups and ammo and yeah.
Or you're playing Zelda and you wander into people's houses and you smash all their pots. And,
Yeah.
And you wander out and everything's fine. You go back in again and they're like, hi, and all the pots are back to normal.
One of the simplest uses of this would be the mountain in the distance or the tower in the distance, where it's like, this is my kind of ultimate goal. And it's very easy to see when I'm getting closer to that goal because the mountain gets closer. And so, that would be like the tower in City 17 and Half-Life series. Zelda has often used a mountain, games like that. And then, those are kind of the very simple ones to understand for the player. But then you've got some on the other side that are more complicated. Like I guess I would throw out Undertale as an example where it's not immediately obvious because, sure, you can play the little mini game, but also you can just say something nice to the and you can befriend them, and then I think there's a whole pacifist way to beat Undertale as well.
That's a great example because and here it was designed this way on purpose, right? So the designer assumes that the player is going to interpret this type of game in a certain way and map the things you do in the game to the game's goal in the, let's say, the canonical way. And what the player discovers, hopefully, is, there's this whole separate, let's call it like a tree, a hierarchy of goals that are usually not supported in this kind of game, that the player can then realize I could just talk to someone and we didn't have to fight. So nowadays we talk about games where typically you can be stealthy or you can be kind of shooty.
Like Metal Gear Solid.
Metal Gear Solid is a nice example. I think the ones like Thief, Deus Ex, and so on. So a lot of games are basically, instead of saying, hey, there's a sandbox, you can kind of do whatever you want. Here's a bunch of weapons, here's a bunch of guns, and the player goes, this must be like a shooty game. And then someone randomly discovers that there's a vent and you can actually crawl through this vent and avoid all its combat entirely and face different challenges like, the scars that won't look at you and so on. This goes to this notion that there's two goal hierarchies. One that the game supports and knows under the hood, and the other is what the player thinks the game supports. The game basically has a bunch of goals that are, I don't want to call them secret or hidden. They're just not part of the player's interpretation. And I think that's a really interesting area in sort of game design, is these sort of players discovering goals that are supported by the game.
I think of this game Fury. I don't know if you've heard of the Furi.
Tell me more about it.
It was from the makers of Afro Samurai. So Afro Samurai was an anime first, and then a studio made a game out of it, and you could see how it was the early version of what would eventually become Fury. Where there was this silent protagonist who was constantly walking along. Afro Samurai had the music of the RZA, which was really cool. Samuel L. Jackson narrating it. This whole concept was sort of refined in Fury, where you were this alien who was being held in a jail in space, and someone has broken you out. And it's in order to get completely out of the jail, you essentially have to do a boss rush. And the bosses are very hard. And then as you walk to each boss, you've got a whole narrative sequence of someone talking to you. Spoilers for anyone listening who wants to play Fury, which I highly recommend. It's a great game. It can be a bit mechanically demanding, but in terms of story, it also has a lot to offer. So, eventually you discover that your very presence will kill the world below. If you're allowed to go out of jail, your very presence turns the plants to ash. And there's no way that the planet can live. And so not only are the NPCs that you come up against trying to fight you, they're also trying to convince you. And they're also appealing to your morality. So it's almost like the reverse of what we're talking about, where in Undertale, you have the option of just appealing to them. In Fury, they're appealing to you. And there's one boss, that's her main strategy, is she is a woman who says look, here's the deal. I'm sure you can appreciate, I'm just trying to save my world. I'm willing to stay here and just, hang out with you. We can, this is a nice place. I think it's sort of like the fifth jail that you come across out of 9 or 10 or something like that. And it looks like a paradise. She's like, we built this for you. There are waterfalls. We can share stories. It'll be a good life. We can have a good life, and then the world below can live. And then you have the choice as the player to take her up on the offer. You can sit down on a bench with her and you can just talk, and the credits will roll. And then half of the game doesn't get played. And I always really admired that as a sort of commitment to story.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the Far Cry games, the one that was set in
Oh yeah,
uh,
that's right. Yeah.
where you show up at the beginning and this character comes in and says, "Hey, I brought you here to," says a bunch of things, and then asks you to like sit there and wait for him to come back. And most players will basically say, "Oh, okay," like end the cutscene, and you stand up and start walking around and
That's
rustling
right.
through the drawers and so on. And if you actually sit at the table and don't leave and kind of follow what the game was telling you, I want you to, or what this character was telling you, the character eventually comes back, the conversation continues, and then roll credits. That was it. You get sort of new
Game over.
cutscene, and you get the ending. You're like, oh, okay, and you basically finish the game in the shortest way possible.
Yeah,
Um,
speed run.
yeah, and I think it's a nice example of sort of the game communicating something, and then the player kind of trying to understand that. In this case, for most players, the genre conventions of these types of games overweighed like what the game was, what a character in the game was specifically saying. And I mean, to be fair, the creators of the game also being kind of sneaky because the question is like, do you trust this character to come back? Is it going to be dangerous to stick around? Should you leave? As a player, you could think like, oh, what's the right thing to do? Um, but I think mostly it was the genre conventions. Cutscene ended, okay, it's action time, and you start wandering around and doing silly things. Um, versus trusting the game's narrative and being sort of complicit in that, like, this character said, "Wait for me here," and so I will. I don't know what else is going on. I'm role playing this character, perhaps as intended. So I thought that was a nice design moment, as it were, for that game.
Yeah, I love that. From that sort of perspective, do you see like a regular mistake that designers make that sort of, with what we're talking about, where the goals that the player sees are different from what actually exists in the game, and there's a disconnect there? Like, do you see any sort of like regular mistakes being made that you would fix?
So I think it's only a mistake when the designers don't have awareness of it, and it wasn't, that was not intentional. Which is very different from like, we're going to have a disconnect, and it's going to be intentional. I'm going to put it in there to see how players do, and it'll be like a fun, special moment with players in a game. I would say typically it's not. Like when I say mistake, it sounds like I'm being sort of critical of games.
Yeah.
Like making games is hard already,
Yeah.
and like I don't want to stand here and say, "Oh, this game made this mistake and this game made that mistake." I think it's more just to point out, "Oh, this game did this thing, and maybe that's interesting, and maybe that's the thing that other games can then say, well, what if we did that on purpose?
Mm.
Is there value there to? Is this a new way of playing with game design?" Um,
Hmm.
we talk about in the paper. We talk about a moment in Skyrim, where you climb to the top of this mountain and you're on the edge, sort of cliffside edge, and there's a waterfall. You kind of stand on the edge of the waterfall, and this message pops up like, "Oh, you discovered," I think it was called Lover's Leap or something like that. Please don't harass me if I got the details wrong. And we
Yeah.
thought, oh, that's such an interesting moment in the game because as a player, you're thinking, what happens if I jump off? What does this mean? And so
The
on.
name itself is a nudge. Yeah.
And the name is a nudge, but maybe you shouldn't because it's just like, Hangman's Hill. It's like, oh, what should I do? Hang myself from a tree
Yeah.
here? Maybe not. Um, and so then the game, if you do jump off, the game sort of they design that as a special moment for players to have a leap of faith, essentially. Yeah, and you jump off the waterfall and you don't die at the bottom, and you find stuff that's story related and so on. So maybe that's a moment that maybe was a disconnect, or maybe they realized in playtesting, you know what, players are always jumping off this waterfall. Like, why, we don't know. But what if we actually acknowledge that? Like, the players came up, had this own goal, they brought it to our playtests, and let's recognize it and then give them something.
Mm.
People talk a lot about in like Nintendo, like Mario games, where if a player sees a place, they're like, oh, I wonder if I can get there, and if they can actually get there, well, give them a treat, at there, like put a star,
Yeah.
put like a collectible, or at least something to acknowledge that, like, good job, here's a thing that you set as a goal you set for yourself, and so we're going to recognize that as designers. I think that's where I prefer to focus my attention rather than, oh, this game made a mistake. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, when I think about what we were talking about with Nathan Drake and, the sort of swaths of bodies that he leaves in his wake, and I think about how to solve that. And I guess the idea that you mentioned around like how can we play with that intentionally, that's really interesting because I know a lot of players expect combat, and maybe it's the type of thing where it's like as a designer, I mean, you can definitely make a game that just doesn't have that, and then the question then becomes like, would players accept that? And then maybe on the player side, we just need to be a bit more accepting of games that don't have gunplay.
I mean, to Nathan Drake games, I think I played them all. I really enjoyed them. I thought they were super fun. The dissonance isn't necessarily a problem, but pointing out that dissonance when it exists, I think is important.
I know the way that I would review an Uncharted, which is very similar to how I would review like a God of War, and I know, there are a lot of critics who feel similarly, is they would, like one of the main lenses they would put over it is pacing. And they would sort of view the combat and some of the set pieces as high intensity, and they would view the climbing and the puzzle solving as low intensity. And so you've got like 2 high intensity activities, 2 low intensity activities. And, they're typically very good at pacing those. So like, you go from like frantic moments into these quiet moments where you're, the Tomb Raider, Lara Croft she's going to have a quiet moment trying to solve the puzzle of the tomb. And it's almost like, I think that might even be more important than the combat itself. So it's like, if you could replace the combat with another high intensity activity that's easy to understand, then you've kind of solved the problem there. Because it's like, you've still got the pacing, which is the most important thing. And then players might find that they don't really miss the gunplay,
Yeah, I mean, let's look at a game and try to understand what was the intention behind it. Like, what are they trying to do with this game? And then, well, how well does it meet that? And for some games, that can be really tricky, right? Like, I'm not really sure what the design intention here. Like, where is this supposed to fit? And so that's why I could say, you know what, I loved the Uncharted games. I thought they were super fun. I enjoyed them, and I don't ask more of them, and that's fine. I'm going to get high stakes, bombastic stuff that's like really in your face and really like amazing. A lot of technical achievements in those games as well. In the same way that I enjoy Call of Duty campaigns, right? But I'm not playing either of those games to have a deep introspection on some issue about the human condition, for example.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And that's fine. Like that there's a place for those games. And whoever cracks that nut of like, oh, can we do both these together? I'm like, wow, that seems like a super big challenge, and good luck for anyone who takes it on. I'd be excited to play that when it comes out. Right.
Yeah. Hey, Uncharted 2's train sequence was good enough for Mission Impossible to copy.
Yeah.
It was pretty much the same thing, beat for beat.
Yep.
I had an equal number of questions about ethics in games. So maybe, I think the podcast is going to probably take a break in December and January. But maybe when we're back, if you're willing, it'd be great to have you back on and we can dive into a whole other topic.
I would love that. This has been fun, and I'm happy to come back as a guest, assuming you'll still have me.
Of course. It's an absolute honor to host you, Jose. A big thank you to you for coming on. Really appreciate it. We will keep an eye out for some of your studies. You mentioned you were, if you want to plug it, by the way, feel free. You mentioned you were working on a couple of studies.
Yet to be finished and submitted. If I had to plug more recent things, I guess I would point people to a book I co-wrote with Benj Edwards on the Virtual Boy. It's called Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy. You can actually read it for free on the MIT Press website. You can also look me up on sort of Google Scholar, and that's a good way to see like a list of all the things I've worked on written. And my email is also easily accessible, and I'm on Blue Sky as, I think, José Zagal.
I'm definitely going to check out that book. And for those who don't know the Virtual Boy, it was Nintendo's years and years and years ago version of VR, which I don't think we got in the West. Is that right?
Oh, no. Yeah, it was released in the US.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Officially only released in Japan and the US. We found examples of it being sold in Mexico, for example, and ads in sort of in the official Nintendo magazines, but it was third-party sort of importers who were selling it.
Yeah. And what year are we talking?
1995. So
1995 VR. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, I'm definitely going to check that out. Jose, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep. My pleasure.